Today, I want to share a story almost lost to time, barely surviving in dusty old newspaper clippings, obscure letters, and decrepit books from over 200 years ago. A tale of war, bloodshed, scientific advancements, and deception. The story of James Tilly Mathews and the Heirloom Gang. For the past 3 years, I've been diving into old books in my spare time. I started with an old obscure medical book, and then it kind of snowballed from there. Eventually, I found myself obsessively hunting down any and every old book I could find. Over the years, I kind of had developed this mentality where I just assumed everything worth reading, every opinion worth hearing, had found its way onto the internet in some way or another. There's no need to ever actually pick up or hunt down an old specific book. Well, long story short, I was way off. I was embarrassingly wrong. There are many, and I mean many stories hidden away in old books that tell the tale of events so radical or interesting that they rival anything from the modern day. The events surrounding James Tilly Mathews are nothing short of a crazed, convoluted mess. This story here very well might be the catalyst or even starting point for what we would call nowadays systematic mind control. Things like MKUltra, psychic warfare, targeted individuals, madhouse reforms, the whole concept of schizophrenia can surprisingly find all their origins right here, all branching out from the events surrounding James Tilly Mathews. But it also takes place in a very important nexus in time. So who is he? Well, in simplest terms, he's a man who made some radical claims. So radical he ended up incarcerated in Bedlam until his eventual death. He was deemed insane, mad, unfit, and even a danger to the public by a doctor named John Haslam, which all took place over 200 years ago. It all makes sense that this isn't very well known, and nearly fell between the cracks of the history room cutting floor. To be honest, the only real reason we can talk about James Tilly now is because of his doctor, John Haslam, the mad doctor who was in charge of his care. Now, when I use the term mad doctor, it's because that's what they were called. Doctors who primarily dealt with mad individuals. But it actually goes beyond that because the treatments these doctors would use themselves is pretty insane. More on that later. John himself was one of the forefathers of institutional psychiatry and mad doctoring. Luckily for us, he was able to put down his torture equipment momentarily and actually wrote about his obscure area of work, in which one of his main subjects were James Tilly. He's the author of one of the books I'm showcasing in this video, Illustrations of Madness. This is the actual book he wrote about James Tilly in 1810. The other source I found comes from an author named Mike J. His book is called The Heirloom Gang, written in 2004. It's on my top 10. There's a lot of work and tons of interesting information in this book. Illustrations of Madness is a short and to the point read. It's less than 100 pages and the font is huge. It primarily focuses on the claims and the accusations levied by Tilly. And it does a really good job of making him look crazy. See, the James Tilly story is quite insane, but everything written about the man and his behavior indicates it isn't that simple. We need to separate those two things. James Tilly the man from James Tilly's radical story. And John Haslam's book, Illustrations of Madness, does not do it at all. The backstory surrounding James Tilly is this. So he was a Welsh tea broker. He often traveled between France and Britain, primarily London and Paris, in the early 1790s. While visiting France, he was incarcerated there and spent a number of months in prison. While there, he claims to have met an inmate, a very strange inmate that would change his life forever, and forcefully thrust him into a vast political conspiracy controlled by a hidden hand. On its own, it's a cool story. But there's a wild card concerning Tilly that really elevates everything to a new level. And that's the point in history when it actually happened, which is smack dab in the middle of the French Revolution. For the time being, it's important to understand that general societal change that was going on in Western Europe at this time, because there was a lot of change going on, like massive political power shifts, widespread cultural change, civil wars, and mass public executions. The hotbed for all this chaos was Paris. In the 1770s through to the 1790s, France and Great Britain were basically at war with each other. They fought numerous scrimmages throughout Europe. Britain was also dealing with the Revolutionary Wars, which saw the 13 American colonies win the War of Independence from them, and France had also been secretly supplying the Continental armies there in support of their separation. So we have a lot of behind-the-scenes action going on. High taxation in France and dwindling food supplies following the wars with Britain is one of the reasons cited for the unrest that developed in France. Eventually, a revolutionary movement kind of emerged consisting of average citizens, statesmen, members of the French military, that sought to end the rule of the current French monarchs residing above them and install a governmental ruling body. In the early stages, it seemed to be the mass majority of people wanted a peaceful resolution, in spite of constant escalation. But unfortunately, in 1789, the revolutionary movement took action by storming and capturing La Bastille, basically a medieval castle that was used as an armory and prison for political objectors. Although itself a small victory, where the revolutionaries lost many more casualties than the opposition, the event was pretty symbolic. It showed that the revolution has power in numbers, and by the end of the year, your average workers were marching on the door of the king himself. A plan was essentially devised to implement a new constitution, and the legislative assembly was going to take over control. James Tilly himself was surprisingly involved in the political landscape during this time, and that's one of fear, uncertainty, and change. A period of plots, espionage, and covert warfare, all alongside military intervention. Very similar aspects that parallel today. James, who started off as a simple tea broker, became interested in the evolving political environment of the times, which led him to meet with a man named Williams, who himself was affiliated with the political scene at the time. From what can be gathered, it's claimed that the purpose of James Tilly and Williams' mission was one of peace negotiations. James claims that he was sent on behalf of the governmental bodies within Britain. When James and Williams made their way to France, they quickly found themselves in a very uncertain position when they arrived. See, Williams was actively involved in the political scene, but he became disenfranchised under the constant power shifts and more or less just left James to his own devices once they arrived in France, which would end up being terrible for James, because as soon as they did arrive, the king was arrested, ending the monarchy. This put France on the brink of war with other countries loyal to the king, and the French border was closed, preventing anyone from just coming or leaving. Now stranded in France without proper documentation, James really only had one option: lay low and write letters to the assembly and hope for some kind of response or aid. One aspect of the story that stands out to me the most is the fact that people tend to chalk up Mathews' entire story as a wild fever dream fueled by some random case of psychosis. But the facts of the situation point to a more complex reality. Mathews very well might have been some type of agent provocateur in one of history's most radical times. Even now, I have to say, I'm not 100% sure which side he was on, or if he was on a side. Was he a British spy trying to get a shoe-in on the emerging government? Or was he an opportunist trying to sell insider information? Or was he just a madman in the right place at the right time? Depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer. The English view? James was essentially a charismatic lunatic with grandiose delusions who, by sheer luck, finessed the French government into believing its fantasy of peace negotiations. The French view? He was a British spy trying to carry out interference and espionage. Either way, his letter writings worked, and James Tilly Mathews met with a member of the government. When he did, he gave them a written peace proposal from Britain and a series of classified documents. Charles Francis Lebrun took Mathews' peace proposal, brought it to the cabinet, and they accepted it, well, under certain circumstances. But the French government was willing to reinstate a peace negotiator, James Tilly Mathews, the man who is generally considered to be the first well-documented case of schizophrenia, a madman with delusions so outrageous that he needed to be locked up in a dungeon for the rest of his life, became the last bastion of a peaceful resolution. Or his delusions were becoming contagious, it's hard to say. Mathews started writing letters back to England to specific governmental members, informing them of his progress. His letters had elaborate instructions for their delivery, all of which was under the utmost secrecy. With permission from the French Assembly, James and his representative rushed back to England to see the delivery through. So far, everything went according to plan. The letters were delivered, but unfortunately there was no word yet, only silence. He then took it a step farther and wrote more letters, and waited even longer. Still nothing, so he upped the ante. Knowing his letters and proposals of peace were delivered and seemingly ignored, he started lobbying different members of parliament. He also started attending debates and spread his story amongst the members. Eventually it was brought up and denied by William Pitt himself. Soon after that, he received the official reply from the British government. They said that they didn't support the Republic administration. Once again, Tilly struck back and went to the media. He had gotten the newspapers, print out numerous leaks from the peace proposal itself, letting the public know about the political shenanigans and Britain's denial of a peace proposal. Unfortunately, it was too late. When June hit in 1793, the political group essentially in charge of France, the Girondians, lost the presidency over the convention, and the Jacobins took over. Mathews once again rushed back to France to meet with the French officials. This time things were different though. The new government didn't believe anything he said and assumed he was a spy fishing for info. After 2 months in limbo, James would find himself being held in custody and questioned while seeking a passport. James Tilly, being James Tilly, wrote a 22-page manifesto about the events that had been transpiring after being bounced around to different officials. Tilly eventually was lucky enough to get one that spoke English. James told the French officials that he knew a number of British governmental secrets. One in particular was an upcoming attack. In 4 days, on August 24th, the British were going to attack Dunkirk, which eventually happened as he predicted, showing that he did have some amount of inside information. It's hard to believe that a simple madman would know that. Tilly was ordered to remain in his boarding house till the government figured out what to do with him, which was probably for the best, because outside in the streets, the flames of revolution were engulfing Paris. The Reign of Terror can be summed up in 2 words: capital punishment or bloodbath, either worked. The 18th century was close enough to us to be relatable, but they still had some medieval aspects of their society that survived the past. Before the revolution, they would set up huge elaborate executions in public and encourage citizens to attend them. They had hangings, but if they really wanted to make an example of someone, which was the real purpose of these public displays, to deter or frighten the public into obeying the laws, they would punish people in ways that are hard to comprehend. Things like stake burning, decapitation, dismemberment, hang, tied, and quartered, breaking on the wheel, all of these were wildly gruesome and highly elaborate displays of punishment. Well, that all changed during the French Revolution. A doctor named Joseph Guillotine, who seemed to be involved in a number of clubs, sought to reform the process and essentially industrialize the whole of capital punishment. Some say he was acting in a manner to ensure equality and create a more humane form of capital punishment, but from his own writings, things point to a different reason. He was involved in the politics during the time and sought to move past all these elaborate methods and introduce a single straightforward technique for capital punishment. Easier, quicker, way more reliable, and most importantly, suitable for mass use on a daily basis. That's the important cultural shift to understand here. Although these old methods were much more gruesome, they were mainly a deterrent to scare the public. Over hundreds of years of the public seeing these, they became desensitized to these gruesome acts. And we can actually see this directly based on how the public reacted. These punishments became spectacles. People would rush to attend them, they wanted to see them. They weren't forced to watch, they sold souvenirs. Handkerchiefs soaked in blood, clumps of hair, stuff like that. They were almost like monthly events. A frightening reality only for those who commit the most severe offenses against the crown. But for the public in a messed up way, they became a form of entertainment. The guillotine, on the other hand, it brought back the fear. Because it was for everyone. And it didn't discriminate on nobility, race, or gender. Hell, you hardly even needed a trial. And in some cases, you didn't even need to be charged with a crime. If the Jacobins simply thought you were not on their side of the revolution, you were done. And the onus was on you to prove otherwise. During the Reign of Terror, they were using the guillotine like a damn industrial assembly line. At its peak, over 100 people a day easy. First the king, then a handful of royalty, and then anyone else who didn't fall in line. It was all or nothing, and the men in charge were going to usher in change no matter what the cost, and that cost would be great for the public and for themselves. From 1793 through 1794, thousands upon thousands of people met their fate. The king, the queen, other members of the royal family, political opposition on both sides, civilians, prisoners, the church. It was wholesale chaos, even with the new religion. The cult of the supreme being. Like I said earlier, any more exposition on the topic of the revolution, and it will overtake the subject matter. If you're one of those people out there who want to know the exact chain of events that led to this, I'd recommend watching Ash Logos' series on the revolution. What I will say is that there was a lot of change happening, too much change, way too fast, and none of it really seemed organic, kind of like it was being influenced. We'll just leave it at that. In a surprising turn of events, James made it through this time unscathed. Probably because the Jacobins were too busy guillotining any official who knew about him. I don't know, the jury's still out on that one. But what we do know is that James found a way to make himself useful. The political chaos bled onto the streets, and a lot of the social infrastructure continued to deteriorate even worse than it was before. Food was starting to become a serious issue. While looking into this, I seen quite a few conflicting opinions on how bad the food issue actually was. Sometimes the issue is glanced over, and then sometimes you see stuff that indicates a much grimmer reality, like people might have been eating other people out of desperation. Severity aside, James took notice of this issue and came up with an elaborate proposal to address the problem. Mind you, he was still under house arrest when he did this. And when I say proposal, I'm talking about a 30-page manuscript on the complete revamp of Paris agriculture. It was a pretty good plan. I'm just going to go right out there and say it. James Tilly was not a dumb man. He wanted to take 3 issues plaguing Paris and use them all in conjunction to solve the food issue. First, Paris had numerous buildings that were pretty much abandoned or underutilized. Bathhouses, basements, greenhouses, all with natural light and ventilation just sitting there. They also had quite a few people who were homeless, unemployed, or incarcerated. And lastly, they had a huge issue with dirt and horse shit clogging up the streets. Tilly proposed that the government should hire those men, or force them, to collect all the shit, mud, and dirt from the streets and use it to convert the extra buildings into natural grow houses where they could immediately start planting mass amounts of cabbage, a cheap, robust, versatile vegetable. Once that was established, then they would start planting potatoes between the rows of cabbage to utilize the growing potential. Within a few weeks of him writing his letter, it had been translated and he had been moved out of his boarding house into police and prison. This was actually a good thing for James because he had accumulated over a year's worth of debt just sitting on house arrest. At least now he could sleep and eat without it costing him. But this win would only be temporary. Because see, while James was in this prison, he would meet a man that would change his life forever. And it all started with a simple but odd question. Mr. Mathews, are you acquainted with the art of brain talking? Not much is known about his time in prison. He was ultimately released after 14 months, where he quickly left for London. For a whole year, nothing is heard of him. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, in 1797, Tilly re-emerged. But he was a different man now. He started mailing statesmen and politicians scrambled letters alluding to a vast conspiracy that stretched across the English Channel and ultimately threatened his very existence. His letters were addressed to Robert Jenkinson, the Lord of Liverpool, and after no response, and in sheer desperation, James broke up a debate in the House of Commons in a radical public display. Once James was taken into custody, he would tell a story so utterly insane that would result in him spending the rest of his life incarcerated. When James was detained and questioned, he claimed that ever since he had been released from the prison in Paris, he had essentially been held hostage and continually terrorized by a gang of horrible spies, political agents, trained in the art of pneumatic chemistry, centralized in London. James claimed that he was being assailed by the Heirloom Gang through a method called brain sayings and sympathetic communication, or as we would call it now, telepathy. The group had the ability to transmit voices, images, directly into people's minds using magnetized gases that were pumped through a specially built machine called an heirloom. They could do this when the victim is both awake or asleep. They would attack the mind with voices while the victim is conscious and manipulate dreams of the sleeping individual by transmitting imagery. They could also induce somnambulism, or sleepwalking behaviors. James was very descriptive in his explanation. On page 41 of Illustrations of Madness, Haslam goes into more detail and writes, "On some occasions, Mr. M has been able to discern them, but whenever he has been watching their maneuvers and endeavoring to ascertain their persons minutely, they have appeared to step back and elude his search, so that a transient glimpse could only be obtained. But the gang relate that they do not actually step back, but at the moment when they are being observed, that they grasp a metal which has the power of weakening the sympathy between them and the person and numbing his perception." The gang consisted of 7 individuals. Bill, or the King, was a 60-year-old man who was skilled in working the influence machine. According to Tilly, James Hadfield, the man who tried to assassinate the King with a pistol a couple years prior, was apparently under the influence of the machine at the time, along with William Pitt in his random bouts of sleepwalking. Jack the schoolmaster. Jack was the recorder. He was also in his 60s. He barely works the machine and resides in an advisory role. Sir Archie is in his 50s, and he's known to be the liar of the group. Some members of the group hint at the fact that Sir Archie might be a female presenting himself as a male. Archie doesn't work the machine directly, they use the magnet, and Archie communicates with Mathews through brain sayings. The middleman is in his 50s and greatly skilled at working the machine. He is also assumed to be the engineer responsible for its creation. He appears to have a vast understanding of the inner workings of the art of influencing. Augusta is a woman in her mid-30s. She acts as a liaison with other gangs within London. She rarely uses the heirloom, and her main responsibility is to influence women via brain sayings. Charlotte is a French woman who spends the majority of her time with Sir Archie. She says she is confined there against her will. She is often restrained, kept nearly naked, and possibly chained to prevent her from leaving. She doesn't work the machine, and she is kept as a recorder. She can communicate with others via brain sayings, which are conveyed in English, even though she doesn't speak English. And the last member would be the glove woman. She never speaks and often travels abroad. She always wears gloves and mittens and is very skilled at working the machine. There are many different locations throughout London that have heirlooms built in them. Nearly every public office has one concealed underground somewhere or within the premises. The heirloom itself is a rather large pneumatic machine, the size of a small car, designed to be used by the gang in a number of different ways to influence the thoughts and actions of their target. Mind control and influence. It functions its best at close range, but can reach up to approximately 1,000 feet. There are undeniable ritualistic aspects of the function of the heirloom, with a slight steampunk feel. Tilly claims that he was first introduced to brain sayings while he was in prison, and ever since then he's been assailed or targeted by this group. He claimed that the motive of the heirloom spies was to cause confusion and disorder throughout the British military at the command of the French governmental body at the time, which I believe was Napoleon. The heirloom had several methods to attack its target, all strange in their own right. I'm going to take a few minutes and read from the book. Fluid locking. A locking or constriction of the fibers of the root of the tongue, laterally by which the readiness of speech is impaired. Cutting solid from sense. A spreading of the magnetic warp, chilled in its expanse, from the root of the nose, diffused under the base of the brain, as if a veil were interpoured, so can't the sentiments of the heart can have no communication with the operations of intellect. Stone making. The gang pretend that they can at pleasure produce a precipitation in the bladder of any person impregnated, forming a stone. Thigh talking. To effect this, they contrive so to direct their voice sayings at the central part of the thigh, that the person assailed is conscious that his organ of hearing, with all its sensibility, is lodged in that situation. The sensation is directly felt in the thigh, and the subject understood in the brain. Kiting. This is a very singular and distressing mode of assailment, and much practiced by the gang. As boys raise a kite in the air, so these wretches, by means of the heirloom and magnetic impregnations, contrive to lift the brain some particular idea, which floats and undulates in the intellect for hours together, and how much so the person assailed may wish to direct his mind to other objects and banish the idea forced upon him. He finds himself unable, as the idea which they have kited keeps waving in his mind, and he fixes his attention to the exclusion of other thoughts. He is, during the whole time, conscious that the kited idea does not belong to the train of his own cognition. Sudden death squeezing, by them termed lobster cracking. This is an external pressure of the magnetic atmosphere surrounding the person assailed, so as to stagnate his circulation, impede his vital motions, and produce instant death. Stomach skinning consists in rendering the stomach raw and sore, as if it had been scalded and the internal coat stripped off. Working with the nutmeg grater consists in violently forcing the fluids into the head, and where such effort does not suddenly destroy the person, producing small pimples on the temple, which are raised and rough like the holes in a nutmeg grater, in 1 or 2 days they gradually die away. Lengthening of the brain. As the cylindrical mirror lengthens the countenance of the person who views himself in such a glass, so the assailants have a method by which they contrive to elongate the brain. The effect produced by this process is a distortion of any idea in the mind, whereby that which had been considered as most serious becomes an object of ridicule. All thoughts are made to assume a grotesque interpretation, and the person assailed is surprised that his fixed and solemn opinions should take a form which compels him to distrust their identity, and forces him to laugh at the most important subjects. It can cause good sense to appear as insanity, and convert truth into libel, distort the wisest institutions of civilized society into the practice of barbarians, and strain the Bible into a jest book. Thought molting. While one of the villains is sucking at the brain of the person assailed to extract his existing sentiments, another of the gang, in order to lead astray the sucker, will force his mind to a train of ideas very different from the real subject of his thoughts, and which is seized upon by the desired information by the person sucking. Whilst he is of the gang, who has forced the thoughts on the person assailed, laughs in his sleeve at the imposition he has practiced. Laugh making consists in forcing the magnetic fluid, rarefied and subtilized, on the vitals, so that the muscles of the face become screwed into a laugh or grin. Pulling or pushing the quicksilver. When the person assailed possesses an intellect sufficiently strong to be conscious of his impregnation, he naturally revolts at the atrocities practiced upon him by the workers of this infernal machine, and he becomes prompted to express his indignation at their perfidy. While in this act, as he supposes of venting his burst of indignation, they contrive to push a seemingly thread of fluid through the back diagonally to the direction of his vitals. Its operation is instantaneous, and the push appears to elevate the fluid about half an inch. This magnetic touch disarms the expression of his resentment, and leaves him impotent prey to the malignity of their scorn and ridicule. Bladder filling is filling the nerves of the neck with gas, and by continued distension, affecting the partial dislocation of the brain. This frequently repeated produces a weakness of intellect. Tying down, fettering the energy of the assailed's judgment on his thoughts. Bomb busting. Bomb busting is one of the most dreadful inflictions performed by the infernal agency of the heirloom, The fluid which resides in the brain and nerves, the vapor floating in the blood vessels, and the gas which occupies the stomach and intestines becomes highly rarefied and rendered inflammable. Occasionally, a very painful distension over the whole body. Whilst the assailed person is thus laboring, a powerful charge of the electrical battery is let off, which produces a terrible explosion and lacerates the whole system. A horrible crash is heard in the head, and if the shock did not prove instantly fatal, the party only recovers to express his sentiment that he has survived the murderous attempt. Gas plucking is the extraction of magnetic fluid from a person assailed. Such fluid having been rarefied and sublimed and is continuous in his stomach and intestines. This gas is in great request, and considered the most valuable of the infernal purposes of the wretches. They contrive in a very dexterous way to extract it from the anus of the person assailed, by the suction of the heirloom. This process is performed in a very gradual way, bubble by bubble. Aside from brain talking, which it seems they were capable of doing without the heirloom itself, all the methods of assailment were a result of this machine. James drew this diagram himself while he was in Bedlam. He's a very good artist if you ask me. This is quite an elaborate setup. The barrels were filled with the seemingly random and equally disgusting mixture of different liquids and bodily fluids. It's hard to say exactly how this worked. The heirloom could just be a radical hallucination manifesting itself as a mysterious machine which utilizes two controversial sciences at the time, pneumatic chemistry and mesmerism. According to James, the process was fairly simple. Let's say you wanted to assail or influence a politician. The first thing you would do would find a place for an heirloom to be built, underground and close to the target's residence or office. The gang would then employ novice members to infiltrate the premises and magnetically impregnate the desired target. They did this by bringing a bottle filled with the same liquid mixture that's in the heirloom in the barrels and stash it somewhere close to the person so they breathe in the fumes essentially. And after enough exposure, they become magnetically connected to the heirloom and the operators. During his 15 plus years of incarceration, the family got numerous doctors to examine James and give a testimony, all of which would deem him completely sane and more than fit for release. But Haslam just wouldn't let him go. Tilly was quite vocal and even presented Haslam with pages of complaints and issues he had with him, along with the way the hospital was run itself. And as a result of that, he spent 2 years handcuffed and chained. As the years passed, Haslam would loosen his reins. In 1810, the governors of Bethlehem set up a contest for the best design scheme for a new institute. James jumped on the opportunity. Unfortunately, Bethlehem and John Haslam didn't save much of James's written material during this time, unless it was incriminating to him, so there's very little information on James's architectural projects. Either way, James was granted permission to enter the contest, and with help from an associate, he was able to come up with a serious entry. He had drawn and painted several diagrams depicting the renovations of the institute, and in total he had about 44 written pages. The main idea was to tackle the general living conditions while increasing potential capacity and even public image. They would do this by adding floors building upward. This way they could get rid of the basement entirely, which was just akin to a medieval dungeon, and use the added space and to create a proper wing for women, who themselves were pretty much just chained up to a cement wall half naked. Proper ventilation and dedicated medical facilities was another issue. James wanted to make a number of small changes to proactively deal with patients' health. He didn't win the contest, which wasn't a big surprise. Haslam had just released his book, Illustrations of Madness, highlighting and rehashing James's crazy story. But even with that floating around, he was still ultimately awarded with an honorary prize of £30. And this kind of sparked an interest in architecture for James. He hired a tutor and even released a booklet about methods and styles for cheap building of houses. Eventually, James would get a brief vacation from the asylum. He started to come down with an illness and was getting abscesses in his back. They relocated him to the outskirts of town for better air quality, but this change of scenery would only be short-lived. Eventually, he was moved back to Bedlam, where he would spend the rest of his days until his untimely death. Mental illness in the 1700s was a lot different than it was today. Any kind of behavior that was deemed not normal was called melancholy. If someone had unorthodox beliefs or opinions that didn't align with the societal narrative, they were melancholic. If they were depressed or antisocial, melancholic. Essentially, if you didn't fit the mold that society handed to you, a madhouse was always waiting around the corner. And this worked for a twofold control mechanism for the general public. It was a physical place to deal with society's undesirables and a deterrent for people who might question the status quo. A fear of ending up in one of these madhouses was a real worry for your average Joe, and more so for women. Inmates consisted of both men and women, people with cognitive issues, mentally disabled individuals, political and religious dissenters, troubled family members, homeless people, and orphans. I'm going to finish this story off by going over the reform James fought for, but ultimately didn't survive to see. In 1815, a committee was appointed to investigate and implement better regulations for the madhouses. They sought to legitimize and regulate the field. Bedlam was one of the places investigated. The appointment of the Select Committee was the result of a range of events and pressures accumulating over some years prior to sessions of evidence, which began in May 1815. Most significant of these marred the scandals following the revelation of William Norris's confinement in Bethlehem, exposed in 1814 by Edward Wakefield, and of large-scale embezzlement and ill-treatment of the York Asylum, made public in 1813. William Norris was a 55-year-old man who was discovered in the basement of Bethlehem. He was strapped to an iron bar that was fastened vertically to the wall, which completely limited his movement to standing or sitting on a small hay bed. When the committee discovered him, he had been restrained in that manner for multiple years. And as you can imagine, there had been multiple deaths within Bedlam itself. The cases of Norris and Mathews were subject to particular concern for the committee, and the death of a patient called Fowler, referred to as hushed up by Urbane Metcalf in his interior of the Bethlehem Hospital, was raised in the questioning of John Haslam. See, Fowler was an inmate that died as a result of Haslam's and Bedlam's treatments. They forced him into an ice bath for extended periods of time. He became unresponsive and was shackled to the wall and was found dead soon after. At the first visit, attended by the steward of the hospital and likewise by a female keeper, we first proceed to visit the women's galleries. One of the side rooms contained about 10 patients, each chained by one arm or leg to the wall, the chain allowing them to merely stand up by the bench or form fixed to the wall or sit down on it. The nakedness of each patient was covered by a blanket gown only. The blanket gown is a blanket formed somewhat like a dressing gown, but nothing to fasten it in the front. This constitutes the whole covering, and the feet were naked. One female in the side room, thus chained, was an object remarkably striking. She mentioned her maiden and married names and stated that she had been a teacher of languages. The keepers described her as a very accomplished lady, mistress of many languages, and corroborated her account of herself. The committee can hardly imagine a human being in a more degraded and brutalizing situation than that in which I found this female, who held a coherent conversation with us and was, of course, fully sensible of the mental and bodily condition of those wretched beings, who equally, without clothing, were closely chained to the same wall beside her. In the men's wing in the side room, 6 patients were chained close to the wall, 5 handcuffed, and 1 locked to the wall by his right arm as well as his right leg. He was very noisy. All were naked, except for a blanket gown or small rug on their shoulders, and without shoes. Their nakedness and their mode of confinement gave this room the complete appearance of a dog kennel. And now with that, I'm just going to leave you with one thought. It is interesting to wonder how much mental illness these places created instead of treated. I bet that would be a really eye-opening study.